Let's go ahead and continue our demo of authentication. Now this time what I'll do is I will use X509 certificates to authenticate a user. Now remember one thing, that we'll be using only certificates here. No user ID and password would be needed. For that matter, you do not even need to have the user created anywhere. The way I'll do it is that I'll create the user certificate outside of the cluster. I'll use a client machine to connect to the Kubernetes cluster. Now let's see how the flow of the user authentication using certificates happen. So we have this cluster, and what I'll do is that I'll create a client machine outside of the purview of the Kubernetes cluster. The cluster has API server, and so far we have been running Cubectl commands after logging in to the master node. And that will change now, because what we'll do is we'll use a user named K8s user, and we'll create an X509 certificate for this user to do the authentication to API server on the cluster. So the first thing that we have to do is that we have to create a private key for the user, and then we'll have to create a certificate signing request or CSR on client machine. The CSR would be created using the private key that we create, meaning that the private key would be used as an input to the CSR creation process. So the first thing that we'll do is create a private key or certificate for the user, and then we'll create a CSR for the same user. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is the client machine. As you can see, the name of the machine is client and the IP address is different. So the IP address of this machine is 10.21.54. The first thing that we have to do is that install Cubectl, because this machine does not have Cubectl. And the first thing that I'll do is install Cubectl here. And this is the command to install Cubectl. Don't worry about the command because it is there in the resources section. This is the document I'm talking about. You have already seen this. I've also put the commands needed for this entire X509 creation in section 9 in instructions of the same document. So install Cubectl, it has been installed. Then change the execution mode of Cubectl. Put Cubectl in the binary directory so that we can run it from anywhere. So now if I write Cubectl version, it will show you that it is a client version, it is a client machine. So we'll use this Cubectl program or the command to send our requests to the API server. Now the first thing is that we'll have to create the private key of the user, and the name of the user would be K8s user. So currently this is the home directory of the client machine. I do not have any files, and the first thing that I want to do is create a private key for the user using OpenSSL command. So this is the command OpenSSL gen RSA, and -out is the private key and 4096 bits. Don't worry and don't even try to understand what these things mean, because you don't need this. I'm just showing you for practice, and typically you will not do it ever. Now if you do ls-l, this is the file that has been created, k8s user.key, and this is the private key of the user. Now I'll have to create a certificate signing request or CSR using this private key. But before creating the private key, I'll have to configure the CSR. I mean, what has to be used in the CSR. To do that, I'll create a file called csr.cnf. So copy and paste these things in the csr.cnf file. Don't try to understand what these things mean, but the only thing that is needed, that you have to make sure that the cn variable should have K8s user. It should not be something else. An organization can be anything. I have mentioned dev, or you can mention training also, and that's all. Nothing else needs to be changed. In fact, you don't have to change anything. The file that I have shown you contains these information. So save this file. Now I'll use this csr.cnf file along with the private key, which is K8s user, to create the certificate signing request. And this is the command. So what I'm saying here is that I'm passing a configuration csr.cnf for creation of CSR, and the private key that I'm mentioning is K8s user.key, and it should generate a CSR file with the name ktuser.csr. Press enter and you will see that one more file has been created. Now this ktuser.csr should be copied over to the master node of Kubernetes cluster. So I'll be using Google Cloud Storage Bucket. If you are using Amazon EC2, you can copy it over to S3, and then from S3 you can get it on your master node. So as this is done, as the CSR object has been created, we'll send it to the master node, and there we'll create a CSR object, and then we'll approve the CSR object. All these will be done using Cubectl command and manifest file. So this time we'll go to the master node and finish off these tasks, creating the CSR object and approving the object. So the file has been copied. This is the CSR file, ktuser.csr. Now I'll have to create a CSR object, and the manifest file is csr.yml, and this is the object. The API version is certificates.kts.io/v1beta1. The kind is certificate signing request, and the name of this object would be ktuser-csr, and the remaining things as is. Make sure to just copy and paste it from the resources. Don't worry about it. We'll not even discuss this in future. One thing that you see is that I have this base 64_csr variable which has been set here. I'll change this variable after some time because the data would be actually pretty big. So that's why I've put a variable here, and then I'll export it as an environment variable, and I'll use env substitution Linux program to change the variable. Okay, this is what I will substitute. Just let me show you. If I press enter, this is the data which will go to base 64_csr. Now I'll put it in a variable, and let me show you the variable here. It should have the exact same value, and let me export this variable. And now if I do an echo, I'll see this variable has been set, and now I'll change the value in csr.yml. So csr.yml had this base 64_csr variable, and will be substituted using the environment variable which you have just set. And the program that I'm using is env-subst. It is a Linux program which is there, and then I'm using Cubectl apply f. And now you see that the certificate signing request or the CSR object has been created. If you want to check the status, it says that the status is pending. So we'll have to approve this particular CSR object. And this is the command to approve the object. So the CSR object has been approved, and if you do a get CSR again, you see that the CSR has been approved or issued. So what we have done here, so this CSR was created using the private key of ktuser, and it was sent to the master node, and we created a CSR object, and after that we approved it. So that means that we have registered this user, ktuser, in our Kubernetes cluster, because this object is there, the certificate signing request is there, which also contains the private key of the user. So it means that this cluster has, or the API server has, some information about the user, which is ktuser. Now I'll have to go back to the client machine to do the remaining configuration or setup. So what we'll do is that we'll create a kubeconfig file for ktuser. Now it is different than .cube/config. I'll show you that shortly. So we'll create this kubeconfig file, and then we'll set credentials for this user using the private key that was created in step 1, which is this one. After that is done, we'll use Cubectl with this configuration file which we are going to create, and then we'll be able to authenticate to the master server or to the API server. So I'm back to the client machine, and I have these 3 files. I'll have to create one more file. Okay, so we'll create a kubeconfig file, and we'll name it as kubeconfig, and the extension does not have to be YML, and then copy and paste this one. There are a few things here which we have to change. The first thing is that the certificate authority data, that has to be changed. Same is the case with client certificate data. These 2 things have to be changed, and we have to put some data around here, and there's some indentation that has to be done. Okay, so the indentation has been done. You cannot, I don't think you'll get it similar in the file. If you do a copy and paste, the indentation might go away. So better to do it yourself. But anyway, so we'll not create any object. I have saved the file. But one thing that we have not done is that we have to change these variables. We have to put the certificate authority data and client certificate data. So we'll get the certificate authority data from master node, and this is our master node, and this is the certificate authority data. So where am I getting it from? If you remember, we use this kubeconfig file. We have seen this file .cube/config, and we have this certificate authority data here. So I'm copying this, and as I said, the indentation might be lost, so you have to be very cautious here, and I'll paste it here. But you have to make sure that the entire thing is a single line. So I fix the indentation. I have put it in a single line, and the same thing has to be done for client certificate data also. But here is the thing, we'll not get client certificate data from any file. We'll have to use the Csr object that was created in the master node. So I'm in the master node, and this is the Csr object. And if you put the output in YAML file, you'll get this status certificate. So this file contains the client certificate, and I'll have to copy and paste this, and also fix the indentation so everything is in a single line. Alright, so I have put the client certificate data also, and now it should be ready. So I have created this kubeconfig file. I'll not create anything from here. Now if you notice that it is similar to .cube/config file in the master node. So I'll come back to this later on, but now what I have to do is that I'll have to set credentials, and I'll have to embed the private key of the user, K8s user, in this certificate. And this is the command kubectl config set credentials. The name of the user is K8s user, and I'm using this private key, and this private key would be embedded in the config file. So there's some problem here. I think the syntax is wrong because I copied and pasted. It should be double dash, and it has been set. So one more thing I forgot to mention is that it's better that you set the context. We have already done it in kubeconfig file, but still you can do it again, and then after setting the context you have to get it back, or you'll have to use it using this use context keyword. Now let's see the kubeconfig file one more time. So everything is fine, the server, the name, and I'll come back to context in some time. So first let me try to run the kubectl command, and now I should be able to run the kubectl get pods or services command from this machine. Now the thing is that you know that when we run kubectl command, it gets the configuration from .cube/config file in the master node. That's what we have done. So I'm in the home directory of the user, and I have .cube directory. There you go. But if I type lsl and check .cube, it is actually showing the config file here also. And if I see this config file, you'll see that it has some other information of K8s user with the client key data that we just created. But we want to get the config from kubeconfig. So first thing what I'll do is I'll run kubectl command just like that. And as you can see, I'm getting this error. The connection to the server localhost 8080 was refused. It is again a very familiar error. Now why we are getting this error? Because this command is going and trying to find the configuration from .cube/config file, but we have not put the configuration there. We have put the configuration here in this kubeconfig file. So we have to mention that, we have to tell kubectl that go ahead and take the configuration from this file rather than .cube/config. So to do that, we'll have to add this kubeconfig keyword and mention the name of the file, which is also kubeconfig. I could have given it something else also. And this is the command I want to run. And remember, you have to mention --kubeconfig and then the kubeconfig file. And you have to mention this option also in secure skip TLS verify, it should be true. Let us go ahead and try to execute this command and I should get error, but the error is different, saying that user cannot list resource pods in API group this in the namespace default. Can I do it in the prod namespace? Let's try and do so. All right, I'm getting the same error saying that the user cannot list resource pods in the API group. So it means that I'm hitting the API server and API server is trying to execute the command. And that's why I'm getting the error. That's why I'm getting this error rather, which mentions that the user does not have access. And the authentication was done, but I do not have access. So I entered the system, but I cannot access the resources in the system. So for that, I'll have to set up authorization, which will be done in the next video. So I hope you have got it now. It's kind of a little complex, but trust me, you don't have to do it. Typically, you'll be using single sign-on or webhook. You'll be using Microsoft AD or Google Cloud or AWS IAM access to provide access to users, or basically to provide authentication to users. But I just wanted to show you that using X509 certificates also you can do authentication, and I wanted to give you a feeling of how authentication works. Before I conclude, let me try to tell you a few more things. So this kubeconfig file has changed a lot over a period of time. You know, this API version is similar to the file which we had seen in the other video, and it is similar to home directory.cube/config file in my master node. So I have the certificate authority data, which I've got it from there itself, and server is same, and the name of the server is Kubernetes. I've got all this information, but there's something called this context. We have not discussed context as such, and the name of the context is KTS user context. Context actually sets the user and its corresponding authentication keys. If you do not set context, you have to set the key every time. So whenever we set a context and we use that context, all these user information will be fed from here to here, will be fed to the kubectl command, and the kubectl command will come here and will check this context, which is KTS user context, and will get these information. If you want, you can add additional context also. So that is on a high level what context does. It is basically a box wherein you put your user and the client certificate data and user's client private key, as those are defined in the config file, and it is associated with this context. Whenever we mention the context, kubectl will come here, find out this context and get the corresponding client certificate data and client key data from this configuration file. So that's all about it. What we have done here is that we have connected to our API server from a client machine using X509 authentication. Basically, we did authentication to our API server using X509 certificate.